My daughter told me I would not get anything from my ex-wife's $88 million will. She said it with a smile that felt like an accusation. My name is Tony Wilshire, and I'm a 68-year-old retired professor from the University of Florida. I lived in a small Jacksonville apartment that kept its habits like trophies. A radiator that clicked at night, a stack of worn books, a framed doctorate watching the room. I taught for 35 years. I liked slow mornings and quiet lectures. My life was modest, deliberate, reparable. I fixed faucets and read late into cold coffee. The phone call was ordinary until it was not. Ben Wilson, a lawyer, told me Angela had died and that I was listed as a beneficiary and emergency contact. I thought it a clerical oddity. Angela and I had been divorced for years. We had drifted into different orbits. Her into boardrooms and contracts, me into classrooms and small mercies. A name in a will seemed intentional, not accidental. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and subscribe. I'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and while you're there, tell me your first reaction to this story. I dressed in my usual neat, unflashy, and walked to the cathedral rehearsing what to say. I expected a ritual. Condolences, public praise, a private ache. I did not expect confrontation. Churches collect grief and also arrange power. The pews filled with polished people who moved like a practiced current. Ariana found me quickly. She was precise and poised, the product of Angela's world. You shouldn't be here, she told me, loud enough for others to hear. You embarrassed her. I answered. I'm here to pay my respects. I felt the old wound surface, the one carved by absence and differing priorities. Ben read the structured parts of the will. Charities, endowments, tokens that tethered a public reputation to civic memory. Then family provisions. The villa, a conditional cash grant for Ariana tied to continued employment. The clause suited her expectations. Reward for loyalty. When Ben unfolded the sealed envelopes, the room slipped into a stillness that felt like a held breath. He read, Angela left $88 million and a 70% controlling interest in Wilshire Oil and Gas Consulting to me, and named me chairman of the board. The room ruptured into noise. Ariana's smile collapsed into something like rage. She accused me of manipulation. Ben displayed documents, competency evaluations, medical attestations, detailed estate planning, that argued Angela's choice was deliberate. The evidence was procedural, not personal. Then he read Angela's letter. On the page her voice seemed different. She confessed she had never stopped loving me, that ambition had driven wedges between us, that she regretted prioritizing success over presence. To Ariana she wrote more sharply, Don't confuse inheritance with readiness. Build your own character. The letter felt like a rebuke and an offering. I had lived a life of small acts, teaching, fixing, returning calls. Those were not currencies Angela's world kept on balance sheets. Yet she chose to trust what I had given the world in steadiness rather than in ledgers. Walking home afterward, the city felt both ordinary and strange. The same buses, the same bakery, but a new map overlaid, the map of obligations, lawsuits, gossip. My apartment seemed precarious, papered now with possible court dates and headline drafts. I tried to imagine the company. Spreadsheets, contracts, executive voices that spoke in liquidity and leverage. At night I read Angela's letter again by lamplight. There is an intimacy to handwriting that formal documents lack. You can hear cadence and regret. She named community clinics and pensions in margins. Circled directives about stewardship. Her handwriting made demands. Protect people, not profit. Teach responsibility. The decision was not a gift that erased the past. It was a charge. My simple life of teaching and small mercies now carried an enormous responsibility. I felt fear of lawsuits, of public spectacle, and a curious ember of purpose. Angela had trusted me to steward what she had built. To refuse would be to refuse trust. To accept would be to enter a world I barely knew. I slept little that week, waking to a city that moved on. Neighbors argued about rent. A child practiced violin. Life's small noises resumed their ordinary importance even as the legal and corporate machinery churned nearby. I felt both diminished and unexpectedly centered. Whatever came next, I resolved to show up with steadiness. Angela's trust had made me accountable in a new way. I had always believed character mattered when it was tested in small acts. Now someone had turned a brand of quiet into an enormous test. I did not yet know if I could pass it, but I understood the stakes. Integrity not as an absence of ambition, but as a willingness to serve when power lands unexpectedly in your hands. Afterward, paperwork arrived. Calls came, old students reached out. I made lists. Who to call, what to learn, whom to trust. The ledger of care had widened. My life had become an answer to Angela's question for good. He said visitation at Christlike Cathedral Thursday at 9. Will reading at 5, your presence required. Some demands are legal. Others are moral. I would attend both, because absence is a kind of admission. The drive to the cathedral threaded me through places that held a quiet archive of our life. A bakery where we had once burned croissants, a corner where Angela and I argued about policy, a lamppost under which we kissed in a life that now seemed like someone else's footnote. Memory settles like dust on familiar streets. The cathedral's steps rose like a formal threshold. Luxury cars lined the curb. The air smelled of lilies and formal grief. Inside, people moved with practiced composure. The room felt like a theater where mourning and management shared a script. I felt conspicuous in my modest coat, an old professor among polished executives. Ariana found me with the exactitude of someone who knows how to claim space. You shouldn't be here, she said loudly enough for nearby ears. Her voice was not merely exclusionary. It was judgment. I answered, I'm here to pay my respects, and meant it with every quiet bone. The eulogy read Angela's public life as if it were a portfolio of achievements. The words, trailblazer, visionary, relentless, sounded like headlines. Those lines did not speak of the domestic ragged edges, of the nights we missed one another for work, of apologies we never fully practiced. Public memory cleans itself. Private memory keeps the stains. After the service, a corporate delegate approached with soft efficiency. We are organizing a succession committee, he said. He spoke in terms that flattened grief into contingency plans. For that circle, mourning and management were contiguous tasks. The cathedral had become an anteroom to corporate transition. Back in my apartment, the city hummed as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I found an old card Angela had once scribbled, remember where we began. Small talismans carried disproportionate weight. I placed it beside my kettle like a reckoning and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easy. The next day, Ben's office felt procedural in a way meant to soothe. He walked me through files and documents with the calm of someone who sees paperwork as a panacea for human chaos. The firm had timelines, notarized drafts, medical evaluations, a list of advisory meetings. Legal thoroughness can inoculate a plan against casual reversal, but it does not answer why a heart chooses as it does. Word traveled in predictable waves. An obituary ran with Angela's portrait and a list of philanthropic gestures. Neighbors nodded as if the world were right. I felt the lonely oddity of being a named beneficiary in a life others had narrated more decisively. The public record was neat. The private ledger was messy and consequential. I called an old colleague and asked the questions you ask when you must learn a new language. What is fiduciary duty? How do you read a balance sheet? His answers were practical. Stabilize pay, protect pensions, audit flagged payments. The advice felt like a map one studies in transit. That week my life condensed into lists, advisors to contact, documents to request, meetings to schedule. Each line moved me further from the campus rituals that had shaped my days. Where I once measured impact by a student's thoughtful question, now the unit of value seemed to be liquidity and contractual obligation. News outlets began to sniff at the edges. Standby reporters circled the law office, and an analyst called with speculative questions. I declined comment because I did not yet understand what I would say. To speak prematurely is to begin a narrative you may not control. I reminded myself that presence matters. Even a humble witness can alter a narrative. Whatever was to be revealed at the lawyer's chambers, I resolved to meet it with steadiness. If the past could be revised by a sentence, I would listen, choose how to answer. We met at a conference where a speaker dismissed structural barriers. Angela stood and corrected him. Clear, precise, unafraid. The room stiffened. I admired her the way you admire a person who speaks truth without spectacle. We conversed after. She talked markets. I talked ethics. Our differences intrigued rather than repelled. We married the next year modestly. Ariana arrived in 1988 and rearranged everything. Parenthood forced priorities and negotiations. For a while we balanced. I lectured. Angela consulted. Then business calls lengthened into nights. Flights replaced dinner dates. Her firm, Wilshire Oil and Gas Consulting, grew from a cramped office into a company with branches and clients that opened doors. Her ascent felt methodical. Client cultivation, offerings refined, decisions made with steady force. She learned to navigate boardrooms where influence folded into strategy. I felt pride and unease. I cherished the slower currency of classrooms. She pursued outcomes that shifted markets. We tried joint projects, symposia, fellowships, but the differences widened. A small argument crystallized into a larger divide. A canceled dinner for a late flight. Angela called from an airport and explained the urgency. I asked when our life had become adjunct to her schedule. She answered she was building something that mattered. I asked her not to let doing drown being. She heard but did not yield. Distance accumulated. Missed events, curt apologies, a marriage of parallel ambitions. By 2010, the practicalities of separation eclipsed romantic rhetoric. Divorce papers formalized what had already been true. The lives we had chosen diverged. Ariana, shaped by Angela's world, gravitated toward ambition. She absorbed boardroom language and performance as grammar. After the divorce, I settled into a modest apartment near campus. The university rhythm steadied me. Lectures, office hours, a student's thoughtful question. Former students sent notes. Colleagues invited me back to guest lecture. These gestures were small salves that restored a measure of dignity and purpose. I do not view Angela's success as betrayal. I see it as two people walking different paths. Yet absence breeds stories. To her, a necessary sacrifice. To me, a loss of intimacy. We both carried consequences. Angela's public triumphs contrasted with domestic gaps. There is one memory that keeps returning. Angela at the kitchen table late at night with a recorder, preparing points for a meeting, yet pausing to ask about a student. Those small kindnesses were proofs that presence could exist alongside ambition. Her business method was rigorous. She tracked metrics, built client networks with disciplined follow-up, and treated reputation as capital. Observing her taught me how systems respond when decisions cascade quickly. Ariana learned that grammar early. She rehearsed pitches at home, anticipated objections, tightened slides. Practice that hardened into habit. I watched from the doorway, proud and estranged. A child raised in that orbit absorbs its language. Her alignment with Angela at the will reading was not surprising. The separation was procedural. Lawyers, signatures, moving boxes. I moved to a modest flat near campus where routine steadied me. Students' notes and invitations to lecture became salves. Former students visited with news of how class conversations altered careers. Those moments reminded me influence can be quiet and enduring. Now, Angela's choice to name me steward reads like an invitation to translate two knowledges: structural savvy and an ethic of care. The work ahead must fuse strategic competence with moral patience. I must learn contract language and hold people affected by those contracts with respect. This memory does not reduce our past to tidy judgments. It offers a grammar, systems and presence, ambition and steadiness. If Angela entrusted me with her life's work, perhaps she believed that this balance mattered more than market success alone. I do not pretend I have all answers. The task of stewardship will be a learning arc: financial literacy, governance, and hard choices about priorities. Still, the grammar I carry, listening, steady presence, moral calibration, matters. If the job requires skill and temperament, I will learn the skill and lean on the temperament, hoping that such a combination honors what Angela created. We did not part ways with fists and slammed doors, but with calendars that no longer overlapped. At first it was cancellations. A dinner called off for a late flight, a parent-teacher night missed because a client needed immediate counsel. Those moments piled into patterns. I remember asking Angela once, in a voice that tried not to be accusatory, when our life had become an adjunct to her schedule. She answered with that steady clarity she reserved for the world. She was building something that mattered. There were other fissures, conversations that became performance reviews, a house where business calls replaced bedtime stories, a daughter learning the cadence of professional pitch. Little things became evidence of larger shifts, the coffee left to cool, a key not hung on its hook, a voicemail unanswered. We learned to live in parallel rhythms rather than intertwined ones. The divorce process was not cataclysmic. We met at lawyers' offices, signed papers, agreed on custody and asset division. It was administrative efficient. That efficiency masked private sorrow. Separation rearranged not only addresses but expectations. Holiday schedules turned into negotiations. Birthdays required permission and planning. Ariana grew accustomed to split allegiances. Her mother's career, my steadiness, and she chose one language to inhabit. After the split, I moved to a modest apartment where the radiator's steady clank became my metronome. Practical life required small competencies I had not previously needed. Insurance forms, calls to handymen, taxes filed without Angela's corporate aid. I learned to ask for help in ways I had not before. Those experiences reshaped a sense of dignity. Self-sufficiency and humility are sibling virtues. There were humiliations and small kindnesses. Once a neighbor assumed I had walked away. I bore the instant social summary without argument. Yet there were gestures from former students and colleagues who invited me back to guest lecture. These reminded me that relevance can be sustained by contribution rather than status. Small comforts emerged, a friend delivering soup, a colleague recommending a repairman, the campus librarian setting aside a stack of new monographs. These were not dramatic rescues but steady, sustaining gestures. Our differences were moral as much as practical. Angela's currency was leverage and outcome. Mine was fidelity to small acts of care. I taught that steadiness mattered in moral formation. She taught that decisiveness moved markets. Both perspectives had truth. The problem was not that one was right and the other wrong, but that they were practiced in ways that rendered the other invisible. Ariana's alignment with Angela was predictable. A child models the parent who exemplifies the life she intends to inhabit. Ariana learned to measure success in deals and briefs. She preferred a life with clear metrics. My presence was steady but less quantifiable. Over time, the specter of irrelevance can solidify into public judgment. People assumed I had been the one who gave up, a narrative I found both false and strangely defensible. I found new measures of value. Students' letters told me of adult decisions I had helped shape, of ethics courses that altered career choices. Those small records of influence mattered. They were not assets on a balance sheet but sources of human capital. Quiet returns that matured over time. I also strengthened a practice of listening. In office hours I learned names and anxieties. In neighborhood meetings I heard practical problems. These habits informed how I later approached stewardship. First listen, then ask questions, then design policies informed by human impact rather than abstract metrics alone. There were stings and quiet recoveries. At a community fundraiser, I was once introduced as Angela's ex, a footnote that taught me how titles can alter perception. I stayed to listen, to community leaders, to retirees worried about pensions, to a clinic director who explained what a stable contract meant for nurse schedules. Those conversations offered a new kind of leverage. Moral rather than financial. I learned practical competence. Reading household finance, negotiating repairs, and dealing with insurance claims. I befriended a repairman named Luis. These small ties were stitches in a life I had to reweave. Divorce left residue, regret and questions of blame, but I focused on repair. Repair is slow and often unseen, yet it prepares one to meet responsibility with humility. Those lessons, humility, attention, repair, would prove essential when stewardship arrived unexpectedly, steadily. She built Wilshire Oil and Gas Consulting from a cramped office and one determined hire into a firm with regional offices and a reputation that opened doors. Her strategy was meticulous. Cultivate allies, anticipate market shifts, and refuse sentiment when a deal threatened stability. She learned to read risk like a second language and to make decisions that bent outcomes toward her design. Where I spoke in hypotheticals and ethical frames, Angela spoke in deadlines and deliverables. She argued that influence required decisive action. I argued that accountability required deliberation. Both perspectives held truth, but they moved on different timetables. She preferred outcomes measured in contracts. I looked for influence measured in human decisions. Ariana grew within that culture. From early internships to leadership positions, she absorbed Angela's cadence. She learned to present data, to anticipate pushback, and to command a room with a tilt of her head. The girl who once built Lego towers now briefed analysts and attended strategy sessions. Pride in her competence was tempered by the knowledge that our family conversations had narrowed into professional forms. Angela's offices had art that cost more than my apartment rent. Executives ate at restaurants whose menus read like collateral. She moved with a confidence that suggested inevitability. Press profiles turned her into a case study. A woman who broke ceilings, restructured partnerships, and turned potential into profit. Friends shifted around that gravity. Some moved toward her orbit, others watched with a mix of admiration and suspicion. For me, the world contracted. Invitations to family events came as items to schedule around business calls. My presence became ceremonial. An approving note at a ceremony, a brief appearance at a child's recital when the schedule allowed. Rumors began to whisper that I had given up, an assessment that stung because it simplified choices into caricature. I found consolation in students' notes and in small civic acts. Former students wrote about transformations sparked in classes. Community leaders asked me to speak at panels. These gestures reminded me that influence can be quiet and long-term. I tended to these smaller currencies the way a gardener tends soil, believing the yield would be latent rather than immediate. There were specific moves behind headlines. A remediation contract that saved a supplier chain, a negotiated restructuring that preserved pensions, and a regulatory fight that protected jobs. Angela's choices carried consequences for workers and towns. They also funded clinics and scholarships she supported. Those actions made her powerful and able to weigh trade-offs few understood. Ariana's marriage to William, who grasped the language of capital, reinforced her standing. Family dinners often felt like strategy sessions. I watched this orbit with pride and dislocation. Pride at my daughter's competence, dislocation at being less central. Community leaders turned to Angela as a patron who could marshal resources. I received calls asking for endorsement or counsel, reminders that affiliation still mattered. Being consulted was a strange grace and a reminder of past connections. When illness took hold, the company showed a calm public face with prepared statements and succession plans. Privately, the board discussed contingencies. That thoroughness fit Angela. She planned for variables as if forecasting weather. I did not foresee the will's shape, though I recognized in her meticulousness a moral intent, to encode values in law and to direct how the living should carry them carefully. I remember walking up those steps thinking of small, private things, a chipped mug, a student's last essay, and then the world rearranged itself into an architecture of wealth. Black sedans, knit gloves, and whispers that smelled of expensive cologne. The funeral felt like a staged transition. Grief and management sat on the same bench. People moved with a practiced cadence, their gestures a script learned and repeated. I had worn the same modest coat I had always worn to important events, and in it I felt the oddness of being both visible and invisible at once. Ben read the bequest's mechanics. Trusts, staged chairmanship provisions, advisory clauses, and provisions for professional managers to handle daily operations. Angela had not imposed a sudden handover. She had built scaffolding. That planning comforted me. She had left a compass as well as an inheritance. Outside, the press circled for a scandal. Inside, Ariana, voiced plans to contest the will. Board members exchanged looks. Some were cautious, others immediately practical. I left the office in slow steps, the city's ordinary noise both ridiculous and consoling. A bus exhaled, someone called a dog, a neighbor mowed a lawn. I felt dislocated and oddly summoned. At home, I read Angela's letter again. She had circled the words stewardship, service, and repair. She had listed priorities. Protect pensions, maintain clinics, avoid dismantling operations for short-term profit. More than money, she had bequeathed instructions and a moral orientation. If her will was a test, then the lesson had begun. I would not forget Angela's trust even under pressure. Ben read the clause with an even voice. $88,300,000, a 70% controlling interest in Wilshire Oil and Gas Consulting, and the chairmanship of the board to Tony Wilshire. The words landed with an odd clarity, precise like a ledger entry and disruptive like a storm. For a breath the room held still, then noise broke the spell. Ariana reacted in a sequence I had come to know well. Disbelief, anger, and then public accusation. She spoke of manipulation and undue influence. Her words poured out with a cadence meant to wound. William moved near as if to shield. Counsel began invoking capacity reviews and legal standards. Ben countered with documentation. Chronologies, medical attestations, notarized statements, turning suspicion into a legal architecture. Sitting there, I felt the private grammar of my life. Lectures, late nights reading, neighborly favors, collide with a corporate lexicon that suddenly governed many livelihoods. I had not sought wealth or dominion. I had lived quietly and taught. The will framed me as a steward, not a magnate, and that nuance mattered at the moment it would matter most. Executives asked practical, procedural questions. How would transition occur? What powers were staged? Who would manage daily operations? Their focus on continuity steadied the room. For them, this was an operational problem. For Ariana, it was a moral fissure demanding remedy. The contrast between tactical voices and moral outrage defined the tenor of the day. Outside the office, the press sensed a tidy story and immediately sketched the contours. Absentee father unexpectedly inherits. Ambitious daughter robbed. Headlines flatten nuance. I understood the appetite for drama, but I also knew that life resists simplicity. The public framing would be blunt. The private work would be slow and complicated. Ariana announced she would contest the will, setting in motion a legal process of depositions, forensic audits, and motions. Her lawyers alleged undue influence and questioned Angela's capacity in windows where decisions were made. The suit turned intimate choices into evidence and raised questions about motive, timing, and intent. I visited a plant town soon after. In a square of municipal offices, a foreman told me why certain contracts had been honored despite thin margins during remediation. To keep payrolls intact and clinics running. He spoke of choices Angela had made in moments of pressure. Actions analysts might call inefficient, but that preserved livelihoods. Those stories reframed dry line items into human consequences. Back in the city, Ben and I planned a response centered on transparency. He advised publishing dated records, providing auditors with complete access, and proactively communicating with workers and community leaders. Angela's careful notes and recordings would be central to demonstrating intent. She had not made a capricious gift. She had documented deliberation. Board members divided. A faction urged swift stabilization, hiring external managers to reassure markets. Another cautioned that hasty sales risked wrecking long-term relationships and community trust. Investors whispered. Unions sought commitments. The company's pulse was uncertain and sensitive to rumors. The legal theater began. Motions were filed, subpoenas issued, depositions scheduled. Each document and testimony would be a piece of a narrative to convince a judge. The courtroom would prefer coherent patterns. Life often offers only messy motives. I found myself reading legal filings the way I once read dense academic papers, looking for implications rather than declarations. At night, I walked through neighborhoods where people noticed me differently now. A neighbor who once waved from his porch offered a quiet look that felt like assessment. Public perception shifts swiftly. Private relationships, however, change incrementally. It was a strange place to be, both scrutinized and summoned to steward something larger than myself. Friends offered counsel in different registers. An old student sent a note reminding me that integrity sustains influence. A former colleague called with practical suggestions about governance. Both anchors were necessary. I needed moral clarity and technical advisors in equal measure. A crucial moment arrived when auditors began reconstructing procurement flows. Emergency payments surfaced that had thin paperwork. Some had benign explanations, others required remediation. The auditors requested access to emails, approvals, and timestamps. Operational improvisations that had kept plants running now demanded paper trails. I felt the moral weight of Angela's choice. She had not simply redistributed assets. She had posed a question about who bears responsibility when wealth collides with human need. The revelation had not been joyous. It was a summons. I would need to learn finance, governance, and the language of shareholders while holding to a compass that prioritized people over short-term profit. I would have to listen harder than ever, to lobbyists, clerks, union stewards, and clinic directors, to learn accounting basics, master patience under public scrutiny, and act with transparency and humility so community trust would not be sacrificed for expediency in moments of pressure, and honor Angela's intent when it undeniably cost me. When Ben unfolded the envelope that held Angela's letter, the room leaned toward a voice that was gone but not silent. There is an intimacy to final words. They are part apology, part instruction, and part map. Ben read slowly so that each sentence might settle into the room with its full weight. Angela began by addressing colleagues. "Thank you for your work," she wrote, and then moved into private matters with a clarity that surprised me. Her first lines to me were simple. She had never stopped loving me and she regretted choosing ambition over presence. The admission was precise and raw, the kind of sentence that can disarm long-hardened assumptions. To Ariana she wrote differently. Praise for intellect and capability, and then stern counsel. Angela warned that inheritance without work corrodes character. She worried that privilege could become a crutch, not a ladder. Her language was uncommonly direct. Build your own authority. Do not assume entitlement. It felt like both motherly frankness and strategic instruction. Angela explained why she had chosen to distribute assets the way she did. She wrote about observation, not whim, a record of meetings, evaluations, and consultations that shaped her decision. She described sessions with physicians, notes from advisors, and meetings where she circled priorities like pensions, clinics, and long-term obligations. Her voice argued that stewardship required character more than capital. She acknowledged mistakes with a kind of surgical honesty. She confessed to losing sight of the domestic ledger in favor of public impact. She admitted that her hunger to build an empire had sometimes eclipsed the small acts that hold a family steady. Her candor reframed old wounds into a moral project rather than a tally of failures. In practical terms, the letter specified governance preferences, staged leadership, an advisory council, and procedures for appointing independent managers when necessary. She attached a timeline and named trusted deputies with notes about each person's reliability. Those details read like admin and absolution mixed. Practical scaffolding for a moral aim. She circled particular words, stewardship, repair, accountability, and underlined phrases about community obligations. In one paragraph she listed clinics that must be funded and emphasized pension protections. These clauses read as fiduciary ethics coded into a will. Ben's voice softened as he read the closing paragraphs. Angela asked for forgiveness in a way that was not theatrical. She asked that the family lean into work rather than grievance, that we recognize wealth as a tool to be used, not a throne to sit upon. She urged Ariana to build competence and to see authority as earned through service. When the reading ended, Ariana's face was a landscape of grief and rage. She paced and accused the legal team of collusion, calling for immediate contestation. She said the letter was spiteful, a punitive act rather than charitable. Her words were theatrical but also born of real hurt. William spoke of expediency and shareholder value. Counsel sharpened arguments into legal posture. Ben produced a packet of supporting documentation. Dated meetings, medical attestations, audio files of Angela explaining decisions. Those materials would be critical should litigation occur. They showed deliberation rather than caprice. The presence of such records did not erase pain but complicated the moral simplicity Ariana sought. I felt the force of Angela's final framing. She had not aimed to punish. She had aimed to instruct. In giving the company to me, she intended to place a moral compass in a world that often circulated incentives divorced from consequence. That compass was calibrated to preserve jobs, sustain clinics, and honor pension commitments even if it hampered short-term returns. Ariana stormed out vowing to litigate. William coordinated forensic counsel and PR maneuvers. Board members took notes and calculated votes. The reading turned into the first act of a prolonged legal drama. Yet Angela's letter had also sown seeds. Community leaders who treasured clinic funding called to express support. A retired regulator offered to consult. Some trustees hesitated about immediate restructuring without review. I kept Angela's letter on my kitchen table and read it nightly. Her handwriting became a manual. Practical instructions intertwined with moral exhortations. The list of prioritized projects became my immediate agenda. I felt the old ache of absence but also the authority to act in ways that honored the values she named. The letter renamed the stakes. This would not be simply a fight about money but a contest about what legacy means, whether it is scored by market caps or by whether a clinic remains open on a Tuesday morning. Angela had made her choice. The battle to honor it required both legal defense and moral clarity. I realized the legal battle would be a test not only of documents but of communal memory. Whether towns and trustees would speak to the value Angela had protected. My immediate tasks were practical: secure audits, arrange counsel, build testimony. Yet the deeper work would be translating empathy and principle into policies that could survive scrutiny and vote. Within hours of the reading, she had lawyers on retainer and a public statement drafted. She would challenge the will. Her words were crisp and rehearsed. Her team framed the move as a defense of corporate integrity and shareholder value. Language designed to transform familial grievance into civic duty. William moved quickly to assemble a team that blended legal acumen with public relations. Crisis counsel, forensic accountants, and media strategists. They constructed a narrative that performance earned reward, and that Angela's choice threatened institutional stability. Their argument married technical concerns with righteous indignation. Ariana's public posture resonated with some. Institutional investors worried about rapid governance turnover. Analysts flagged volatility. In private, certain board members expressed alarm that having a chairman unfamiliar with market mechanisms could spook stakeholders. The conversation was no longer merely familial. It had become a governance debate with real consequences for employees and towns tied to company contracts. Her lawyers filed a complaint alleging undue influence and questioning Angela's capacity at critical times. The complaint was meticulous. Dates, alleged inconsistencies, and witness requests. Litigation would not be resolved by moral rhetoric alone. It would demand documentary evidence and expert testimony. The legal machinery had begun to hum. Ben and I responded with our own counsel, compiling records and audio files. We prepared to show that Angela's decisions were deliberative and documented. Ben emphasized method. Competency records, notarized drafts, and witness statements used not to silence hurt but to argue intention. Our legal posture sought to convert Angela's moral reasoning into admissible proof. At home, the first week after the reading, I kept a running list on legal pads. Call the auditor, contact the retired regulator Angela recommended, meet the plant manager, request contract files. The list read like a syllabus for an unfamiliar course. Corporate Governance 101. I called an old student who had become a financial analyst and asked him to explain basic market terms. He obliged with the patience of someone who once sat in my classroom. Media coverage intensified. Opinion pieces parsed motives and performances. Social feeds split into camps. Some voices argued that Angela had given a principled lesson. Others sided with Ariana's sense of betrayal. The company's stock wavered on speculation. For employees and suppliers, rumors mattered because they affected payroll and contracts. The stakes again were less about money than impact. Ariana's move forced boards and trustees to take positions. Some directors privately pressed for quick stabilization. Hire interim managers, isolate the chair's powers, and proceed with a strategic review. Others insisted on respecting the will's process and requested patience until audits concluded. Votes became possible weapons in a proxy battle. I watched those maneuvers with a mix of surprise and, oddly, gratitude for their procedural clarity. We scheduled depositions. We began to prepare witnesses who could attest to Angela's lucidity and deliberation. We reached out to clinic directors and pension trustees to document the real-life stakes of contracts in question. Those voices would not be courtroom showpieces but necessary testimony about the consequences of abstract decisions. A friend from the university sent a short, fierce email. Fight with facts, not fury. That advice anchored me. I also met with community leaders who had benefited from the clinics Angela had funded. Their stories, nurses who kept shifts, patients whose lives were steadied by an appointment, would eventually matter in a court of public opinion, if not as direct evidence in court. Meanwhile, Ariana's team filed motions aimed at limiting my authority pending discovery. They sought temporary injunctions. The legal skirmishing was designed to shape the battlefield. If the rules could be narrowed early, they could limit the practical effect of the will even before a verdict. It was aggressive and dangerous in its potential to disrupt lives. I found myself translating moral claims into governance proposals. Where Ariana claimed risk, I proposed audits, independent reviews, and governance safeguards. Where she proposed rapid asset reallocation, I proposed phased, impact-reviewed transitions. I believed in stability and correction rather than punitive dismantling. The courthouse steps became a new public stage where statements were released and cameras gathered. A cold smile sometimes passed between Ariana and me in public, a recognition that the duel would be strategic and long. There was no reconciliation in those smiles, only resolve. Legal filings multiplied. Discovery began. Trustees and regulators were queried. The company's employees watched from the middle, uncertain and anxious. My days filled with briefings and calls. My nights with study of documents and consolations from former students and neighbors. The work felt exhausting but necessary. In the months ahead, depositions, audits, and shareholder votes would accumulate into a verdict not only about a will but about values. I would prepare evidence, listen to communities, and insist our decisions be measured by their human consequences. That became my mission, to convert love into accountable stewardship. Always. I carried Angela's letters folded in my jacket like small maps. The boardroom smelled of varnish and intent. Tablets glowed and people who measured risk by margin slid documents into neat stacks. Laura Mendez, the interim counsel, offered a steadying nod. "We prepared a transition plan," she said. "We need your judgment on values and direction." I set Angela's folded script on the table and listened. The vocabulary of fiduciary duty and liquidity was new to me, but I found analogies that helped. I asked careful questions and admitted ignorance where it mattered. Financial modeling and crisis hedging, and my candor drew respect. Angela's margins contained more than apology. They named trusted deputies, listed community clinics to protect, and a circled directive. Stewardship is service, not dominion. Angela had left scaffolding for a transition. A provisional committee, contingency managers, and clauses for external oversight. That machinery could function while I learned. I sat with department heads to understand obligations, to retirees, to towns dependent on supplier contracts, to environmental remediation efforts. Marcus, the operations lead, explained schedules and safety protocols with patient precision. I took notes. My silence encouraged detail. I accepted tutors on basics, balance sheets, cash flow, and how to read an auditor's table the way I once taught students to read a primary text. Line by line, asking what each entry intended to show. The work was humbling, precise, and steadily instructive. I began translating Angela's moral notes into policy proposals. Protect pensions, maintain clinics, avoid sales that gutted infrastructure and livelihoods. The board agreed to staged responsibility. Tony as chair with professional managers handling daily operations. Public relations mattered too. A crisis consultant taught me phrasing. "I have been entrusted," he suggested, rather than "I own." Former students sent notes about how my lectures had shaped them. Those messages steadied me more than any PR script. I learned to frame decisions as promises to honor rather than claims of entitlement. That orientation shaped my first substantive choice. Honoring a supplier contract that, while not profit-maximizing, kept a small town's payroll intact. The decision cost potential short-term leverage but paid back in credibility. Employees who heard the commitment began to speak about the company as more than a ledger. Marcus confided that Angela had feared profit without conscience. His memory affirmed my instincts. Auditors compiled a list of liabilities. Quasi-off-book payments, rushed vendor renewals, and one consulting arrangement that required further scrutiny. I scheduled immediate audits and prioritized transparency. Nightly, I read Angela's notes by lamplight, tracing her handwriting as if it might yield tone. I wrote lists, advisors to consult, people to meet, immediate fixes and longer reforms. I called a retired regulator she had named and asked blunt questions. The regulator's counsel was pragmatic. Stabilize operations, audit fully, and communicate openly. He said I must be a steady authority, not a spectacle. My awakening was incremental labor rather than a coronation. I learned to convene experts and to hold the space where technical skill and moral purpose met. Investors demanded clarity. Unions demanded promises kept. Each request was a test. I found my compass in Angela's admonition to prioritize people over profit, and I resolved to translate that compass into concrete policy. I compiled a roster of external managers and insisted major transactions include audits and impact assessments. I convened community relations to chart clinic funding and met pension administrators about solvency. Those meetings were technical and tender, requiring spreadsheet fluency and empathetic listening. I began to see the company as a web of human commitments. Each contract was a thread tied to livelihoods. Sometimes at night I wondered if force would protect faster than patience. Angela's letters counseled restraint. She had chosen me because steadiness outlasts fury. So I moved deliberately. Temporary freezes on speculative sales, independent audits, and an advisory council including community representatives. The moves were modest but signaled a different stewardship ethos. Employees noticed. A line worker who had served decades said, "We needed someone who listens." A clinic director wept when I pledged continued funding. Those ordinary acts of repair built moral capital that mattered when shareholders measured more than quarterly returns. Operationally, it was messy. We found contracts with scant paperwork, approvals signed late at night, and vendor invoices lacking clear descriptions. Some anomalies were benign. Others needed restitution. I ordered a forensic review and promised the board full disclosure. Transparency, I decided, would be my first defense against suspicion. There were days I felt like an imposter. Other days I felt the weight of trust settle into my shoulders. I held community meetings, visited plants, and learned the names of workers who had once been numbers in a spreadsheet. Angela's project had human faces. Recognizing them changed how I approached governance. By the end of my first quarter I had a modest plan. Stabilize finances, audit contested payments, preserve social programs, and institute transparent governance. It was not radical but earnest. Angela's voice remained my compass. For the first time since the will's reading I felt the steady warmth of purpose. I closed the folder and prepared for the stewardship ahead, knowing that each small act would either truly honor her intent or reveal how fragile trust can be when translated into policy scrutiny. I discovered Angela not only in legal filings but in margins, journals, and a thumb drive labeled stewardship that read like a founder's confession. Her notebooks were practical and intimate. Beside names she had written shorthand, Marcus, steady, Mira, trustworthy, and she circled phrases with a firm hand. Stewardship is smaller than dominion. She had sketched a transitional committee, named deputies, and noted triggers for external oversight if leadership instability threatened operations. The archive felt like guidance from someone who refused to leave her work to chance. The thumb drive contained recordings. Angela explaining why she preserved low-margin contracts to keep towns solvent and why she had authorized emergency payments during remediation. Hearing her voice made the company feel inhabited by intent rather than spreadsheets. Those recordings were both protection and peril. They showed deliberation but also highlighted payments with sparse paperwork that auditors would later scrutinize. I convened a confidential audit team, internal compliance, external counsel, and a retired regulator Angela had recommended. We traced payments, interviewed field managers, and mapped timelines. Some anomalies had benign explanations, expedited reimbursements and emergency disbursements. Others required remediation. Missing invoices, rushed approvals, and approvals routed through a manager whose ledger entries matched notes Angela had circled in exasperation. Mira Alvarez, the PR director, became an ally. She produced a dossier of community projects Angela had quietly funded. Clinics, scholarships, and pension supplements. Those files reframed line items as commitments to people, and clinic directors' letters later proved vital in public conversations. The auditors found a pattern. During crises, some approvals bypassed ordinary scrutiny. In the heat of remediation, managers prioritized plant continuity over documentation. The trace suggested that expediency sometimes opened shadow channels. I ordered a full mapping of procurement flows and insisted each contested payment carry a chain of documented approvals and rationale. Before public disclosures, I found a sealed note in Angela's hand. If they litigate, do not retaliate. Let the facts stand. The instruction felt like both counsel and plea. I took it to mean transparency and repair, not revenge, should guide us. We published limited audited summaries and commissioned an independent review of flagged payments. Those steps alarmed short-term investors but steadied clinic directors and pension trustees. The independent review recommended clear procurement protocols, documented emergency measures, and restitution when payments lacked adequate backup. In parallel, I met with community leaders. A clinic director described how a low-margin contract had kept nurses on payroll during a crisis. A foreman described choices made to prevent a shutdown. These human testimonies reframed financial anomalies as deliberate acts to preserve livelihoods. That reframing mattered in the court of public opinion. Some items were messier. An advisory agreement with a consultancy had thin deliverables and payments that coincided with rapid expansion and remediation work. The auditors subpoenaed emails and interviewed managers. The narrative was complicated. In moments of pressure, people cut corners to keep operations running. Those corners sometimes became gray areas warranting correction. As audits proceeded, a mid-level manager who had processed invoices on verbal direction admitted his choices were aimed at continuity. He lost his role, a painful but necessary decision to uphold institutional trust. I offered retraining and support while making clear accountability would be enforced. We created an oversight committee blending external auditors, community representatives, and the retired regulator. The committee monitored remediation and governance fixes and offered a transparent channel for updates. We also published summaries for employees and trustees to show progress. Myra's dossier and clinic letters shifted the public narrative. Community leaders vouched for Angela's commitments. A retired regulator agreed to consult. Those endorsements did not end litigation, but they complicated the simple story the press preferred. Nightly, I read Angela's handwriting, which mixed pride and regret. She had been ruthless in market terms yet tender about promises to communities. That tension explained much. Expedient choices in crisis balanced against long-term commitments. Her notes taught me stewardship requires both expedience and accountability. Transparency became our method. We remediated payments where appropriate, documented decisions, and opened our books for independent review. The work was slow, awkward, and necessary. It converted ambiguity into accountability and suspicion into a process that could, with patience, rebuild trust. I learned to listen to the human voices behind ledger entries. Nurses, plant foremen, and clinic administrators. Those stories shaped policy more than abstract arguments. Angela's archive guided the repair. The audits enforced correction. Together they transformed uncertainty into a disciplined plan for governance that honored what she had protected. People and their livelihoods. I moved through it with humility and resolve. Her complaint alleged undue influence and questioned Angela's capacity during windows when critical decisions were made. The filing was meticulous. A chronology of meetings, witness requests, and contentions about inconsistent statements. Litigation converts meaning into evidence, and Ariana's team sought to build a pattern that would convince a judge to set aside or modify Angela's testament. Ben and I responded by assembling records, notarized drafts, dated meetings, medical attestations, and audio files of Angela explaining her rationale. We prepared witnesses, physicians, longtime assistants, and advisors, who could attest to Angela's deliberation. The goal was to translate Angela's moral logic into admissible proof. The courtroom's appetite is evidence. Narrative alone would not suffice. Depositions multiplied. A physician testified to Angela's lucidity during key sessions. A longtime assistant described detailed conversations around succession. A financial advisor confirmed protracted estate planning. The defense introduced recordings where Angela articulated her values about stewardship. Those clips made her voice present in the room and reframed the dispute around intention. Operational anomalies surfaced as evidentiary threads. A procurement analyst testified that, during remediation, he processed vendor invoices on verbal direction to avoid shutdowns. The image of paperless repairs troubled the judge. Ariana's counsel argued such informality suggested governance lapses that merited judicial scrutiny. My counsel countered, crises force choices that preserve jobs and operations. Context matters. The court ordered forensic audits and psychiatric evaluations to probe capacity claims. Discovery became exhaustive. Emails, board minutes, reconciliations, and reconciled entries turned into volumes of exhibits. Litigation turned a private family history into a public archive of documents. The press raced to render the legal fight into tidy narratives. Absent father suddenly wealthy, ambitious daughter denied. Commentary simplified motives. Social feeds split into camps that favored principle or preservation. But beyond headlines, the legal process required precise factual constructions and expert testimony. Unexpected witnesses complicated the picture. A clinic director testified about how Angela's low-margin contracts preserved critical services. A retired advisor corroborated that Angela had explicitly discussed naming a steward who cared about community programs. Those testimonies complicated the binary Ariana hoped to present and reminded the court that the estate's distribution implicated more than family sentiment. The forensic audit charted procurement flows, validating some emergency payments and flagging others for remediation. Auditors reconstructed approvals, interviewed managers, and found gaps. Invoices without clear descriptions, approvals after the fact, and one advisory contract whose deliverables were vague. The audit recommended restitution where necessary and stronger procurement controls. Expert witnesses debated testamentary capacity. Psychiatrists examined cognitive function. Legal experts opined on the sufficiency of Angela's planning steps. The defense emphasized long-term deliberation and multiple advisors. Ariana's counsel focused on timing and vulnerability. The judge, constrained by law, weighed these competing frameworks. Meanwhile, corporate governance rattled. Directors debated engaging external managers, shelving potential asset sales, and how to reassure investors while litigation proceeded. Market analysts modeled scenarios. Activist funds whispered about board changes. The company needed clear stewardship even as legal uncertainty swirled. I traveled to sites, meeting plant managers and community leaders, documenting the human stakes behind recitals of payments. These visits produced affidavits from nurses and foremen who testified about payrolls preserved and clinics maintained. That local testimony mattered. Juries and publics often listen to human consequence in ways that spreadsheets cannot. In court motions flew. Motions to compel, to limit discovery, and to challenge admissibility. Each procedural skirmish shaped what the judge would see, tightly framed exhibits or sprawling narratives. Our strategy prioritized reconstructing Angela's deliberations as consistent, well-documented, and intentional. Settlement whispers circulated, mediators suggested talks to avoid a trial, but Ariana refused to relent, insisting on adjudication. Media amplified each motion and turned witnesses into caricatures. My days narrowed to documents and calls, nights to reading transcripts. I felt exhaustion and resolve. Yet amid the legal grind I found clarity. To honor Angela, I had to connect ledger entries to lives, to show why decisions that looked messy were in fact choices to protect people. The courthouse hallway is a place where glances become strategies, and on the morning of the evidentiary hearing Ariana and I exchanged something like an acknowledgement. Two cold smiles that meant the contest would be clinical and relentless. Inside the courtroom, evidence replaced oratory. Forensic accountants presented procurement flowcharts. Psychiatric reports arrived in sealed binders. The hearing focused on documents. Invoices, notarized minutes, and Angela's recorded explanations. Ariana's counsel emphasized timing and pattern. How payments clustered around crisis periods and suggested systemic informality. Our counsel countered with corroborating minutes, dated correspondence, and witnesses who recalled Angela's explicit naming of me as someone whose moral judgment she trusted. A dramatic moment came when Mira Alvarez took the stand. She described Angela's investments in clinics, scholarship funds, and discrete pension supplements for long-serving workers. Myra's testimony humanized choices that would otherwise look like cold calculations. She recounted a clinic that would have closed without a contract Angela insisted on keeping, and a pension top-up that prevented retiree hardship. These specifics translated ledger entries into human consequence. A procurement manager's testimony complicated narratives. He explained approving payments under pressure to prevent shutdowns and preserve jobs, describing nights when units would have gone dark without expedited authorizations. Ariana's team argued such informal approvals showed governance lapses. Our side framed them as emergency measures that preserved livelihoods and required subsequent documentation. The judge asked pointed questions about patterns and intent. Counsel answered with documents, witness recollection, and expert testimony translating operations into legible evidence. The proceedings became a contest of how to read motive from paperwork, a precise task that turned personality traits into traces on paper. Boardroom fissures were visible. Directors once unified around Angela's leadership found themselves split. Some insisted on meticulous judicial review. Others emphasized the practical damage that hasty restructuring could inflict on communities. The stakes were legal and reputational. A rushed vote might placate activists but destroy long-term value and community trust. Outside the courthouse, the press spun narratives. Opinion pieces simplified the dispute into a morality play. Duty versus desire, stewardship versus entitlement. Social feeds polarized. But for people at plants and clinics, the issue was less metaphor and more consequence. Jobs on time, clinics open, medication supplied. That ground-level reality shaped testimony and, crucially, public sympathy. After Myra's testimony, the hearing continued with expert witnesses. Forensic accountants traced anomalies and proposed remediation paths. A retired regulator testified about standard procurement practices and the need for documented emergency protocols. Psychiatric experts testified about Angela's cognitive status at signing. Their reports were technical, cautious, and consequential. The judge weighed methodical expertise rather than rhetoric. Cross-examinations were surgical. Each question aimed to unsettle recall or clarify timing. I watched witnesses struggle with memory under pressure and felt the moral awkwardness of a private life rendered into evidence. Litigation flattens memory into testimony. It is merciless in that way. When the court recessed, I walked into the hallway and found Ariana. We stood with counsel flanking us, and in that tight moment we exchanged cold smiles, recognition that neither spectacle nor sorrow would end this contest. The smile was not reconciliation but a tacit pact. Strategy would replace sentiment. Later a trustee said that community affidavits had unsettled him. Another director fretted over shareholder confidence. The media's framing propelled proxy gossip. Activist funds smelled influence. The board held emergency calls and scheduled votes on interim measures. The hearing's ripples reorganized power. I read Angela's letters aloud with Ben and Laura that evening. Her cadence mattered. Her recorded explanations paired with clinic affidavits made a compelling moral tableau. I briefed community leaders, visited a clinic, and documented those visits for filings. Grassroots moves were persuasive public record. The judge ordered additional discovery and a focused independent audit on procurement. The legal timetable stretched. No one won in a day. Instead, the case became slow attrition. Filings, depositions, audits, and strategic communications. I learned the political arithmetic of governance. Votes, not proclamations, decide outcomes. So I built coalitions, engaging regulators, trustees, and union leaders to document the stakes. Coalition building seeded public trust and boardroom influence. At night I wrote lists, policy fixes, audit steps, names to meet. The work was pragmatic. Codify emergency protocols, require post-action transparency, and establish an oversight committee with community representation. Those measures addressed legal concerns and honored Angela's moral purpose. The cold smiles in the hallway marked a passage from private grief to public responsibility. What followed would be less cinematic and more administrative. Audits, governance reforms, outreach, and far harder than any speech. The hearing clarified the battleground. Not just wills and words, but the everyday systems that sustain communities. I would hold firmly to that. I signed provisional documents with COM, a conditional chairmanship, staged authority, external counsel, and an explicit mandate to protect clinics and pensions Angela had insisted remain funded. The clauses read like caretaking instructions. Legal cadence could not erase the moral purpose beneath them. Ariana reacted predictably. She mobilized counsel, courted activist shareholders, and framed my interim role as an obstruction to decisive action. William coordinated analysts and drafted memos emphasizing speed and liquidity. Their public posture promised rapid restructuring as a cure for market anxiety. My opening moves were small and visible. I authorized a forensic audit of flag payments, authorized a modest emergency fund from Angela's trust to keep clinics open, and issued a statement stressing stewardship and transparency. I invited independent review rather than hide behind silence. These gestures steadied clinic directors and pension trustees more than analyst notes could. The battle split into two theaters: the courtroom, where Arianna alleged undue influence and capacity issues, and the markets, where activist investors whispered about asset sales and immediate returns. Directors divided. Some feared reputational damage from hasty divestitures. Others prioritized fiduciary duty. The boardroom became a stage for quiet votes and negotiations. Leaks worsened matters. A procurement memo with sparse records surfaced online. An analyst's brief speculated on sell-offs. Rumor outpaced audits. I learned silence can be read as guilt, so I began regular briefings with community leaders, compiling testimonies tying contracts to paychecks and clinic hours. Those narratives reframed ledger entries as human consequences. Arianna sharpened a proxy campaign, courting funds obsessed with quarterly metrics. Her message resonated with investors focused on short-term returns, turning governance into a proxy contest. She argued unlocking capital by selling assets. She framed patience as inertia. Then auditors found payments to a contractor during rapid expansion that lacked full documentation. The discovery could be damaging or an opportunity. I chose transparency, full disclosure, independent forensic review, and restitution where warranted. The admission cost political capital but gained credibility. Community voices mattered. Clinic managers, pension trustees, and town leaders publicly commended continued funding. Local media amplified stories about nurses relying on payments and elderly patients keeping appointments. Those narratives complicated investor calculus. Proxy meetings became battlegrounds. Directors counted blocks and negotiated side agreements. Some pledged conditional support for my chairmanship if external managers were engaged and oversight committees included investor representatives. That compromise bought breathing room. I pursued philanthropic partnerships, announcing a matched grant to secure clinic funding. Arianna countered with a divestiture plan promising capital and efficiency. Each move shifted boardroom calculus. Strategically, I focused on two tracks: legal defense and public legitimacy. Legally, Ben compiled records and lined up experts to rebut capacity claims. Publicly, I amplified clinic testimonies, published impact reports, and proposed governance reforms. Clearer procurement controls, emergency protocols, and transparent reporting. I insisted major asset sales include social impact assessments. I moved into granular work, meeting union reps, visiting clinics in the rain, and compiling affidavits about how a contract change would close a town's only clinic. At a union hall, a nurse described how predictable funding meant schedule certainty and how the threat of sale had imperiled entire shifts. Those testimonies entered our public record and our briefings to doubtful directors. We tightened governance proposals, a phased asset review requiring impact assessments and community consultation before any sale, a stewardship charter codifying Angela's mission with clauses prioritizing pensions and clinics, an external manager for non-core assets, and a quarterly independent audit schedule to reassure markets. Investor conversations were painstaking. Some funds pressed for quick returns. Others responded to data and human testimony. We held one-on-one briefings, answered technical questions about cash flows, and presented scenarios showing how phased sales could preserve value while protecting obligations. Gradually, the argument for measured stewardship gained traction among a critical quorum of shareholders. A trustee with influence sided with patient remediation over hasty liquidation. That endorsement mattered in proxy math. Momentum tilted toward cautious reform as governance structures tightened and external oversight increased. The press simplified the story: a father struggling to steward versus a daughter claiming inheritance. Headlines flattened nuance. My work was practical. Codify emergency authority, launch a procurement portal, and secure a fund to support clinics during litigation. Administrative moves matter more than drama. Internally, auditors reconciled flagged items, HR stabilized payroll, and operations kept safety standards. External managers took narrow portfolios. Community representatives joined oversight committees. These administrative steps reduced operational risk and signaled accountability. Ariana pressed legal fronts. Discovery widened and depositions continued. We argued motions and prepared for months of process. The proxy calendar remained active. Votes loomed, and shareholders weighed patience against short-term returns. As the chapter closed, I recognized the war over legacy had moved beyond family drama into a broader debate about how corporations balance profit and public obligation. The fight would be waged in courtrooms, investor meetings, and town halls. My strategy was simple: transparency, accountability, and insisting legacy be measured not only by market cap but by whether a clinic stays open on a Tuesday morning. I prepared for votes, confident that careful work might sway enough minds today. I braced for more filings, more proxy battles, and more patient governance. The mantle of stewardship felt heavy and necessary. I intended to carry it with humility and resolve. After everything I've lived through, the battles over family, power, and promises, I find myself asking questions I cannot answer alone. What does true character mean when it's tested by temptation? What does integrity demand when silence might protect you, but honesty could cost you everything? Is entitlement a right we inherit, or a burden we impose on others? How should love be measured? In loyalty, in sacrifice, or in truth? And when it comes to responsibility and legacy, is it about what we leave behind or how we carry the people who depended on us while we were here? I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what character, integrity, entitlement, love, responsibility, and legacy mean to you. Your perspective matters, because in the end, legacy is not only about one family's story, it's about the values we all choose to uphold.